Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video, we're going to talk about target selection. I've been meaning to do a series for a while on target diagnostics, shot group diagnostics, but I realized before I have to do that, we have to address the target and what the target has to do with and how the target plays into our ability to develop our skill. Targets come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, literally. Some of them are not very realistic. They're more based for competition shooting or some kind of game or something like that. You've all seen those kinds of targets. Some of them are just for entertainment purposes only, and others do their best to approximate a realistic anatomical presentation of the human form because it's more of a self-defense focused target. The issue we have is no one has been able to create a consistent consensus outside of competition shooting on what good scoring zones or accuracy zones are. Targets come in many shapes and sizes, so do the scoring zones on them. Most of your qualification targets that you see are an arbitrarily agreed to standard for court defensibility. They're not necessarily developed to build a good shooter. They're developed to get a shooter that can meet a compromised standard of performance in order to stay on the job with their gun in their holster. My preferred target, you've seen it before, I've been in class, you've shot on this and been aggravated by it, is this right here. This is my standard two-dimensional target. It has a 4x6 A zone and it has an 8.5x11 B zone. I've got a cranial circle, a little triangle going on up there. If you've seen the later versions, there's actually a Sage Dynamics version of this target now that has some extra stuff added to it. It does have a rough representation, a very basic representation of anatomy, which I appreciate. It doesn't overcomplicate. The reason I like it, the fact that it doesn't overcomplicate, is because you cannot take a three-dimensional thing and make it two-dimensional. If you don't believe me, go ahead and peel an orange and lay the peel flat without, well, putting it into more than, 18, 20, 25 pieces. There's going to be some distortion that takes place in anatomy when you try to take something three-dimensional, make it two-dimensional. Not a big deal, and we still should strive for the most realistic targets possible, even with two-dimensional targets. But it's definitely something that needs to be addressed when we talk about choosing a target that we're going to shoot on. Another target I use, same basic shape, same silhouette, same scoring zones, 4x6, 8.5x11. This is basically the same target system, the UTC system from Targets Online. And this is one of two pieces that creates a three-dimensional target. Why are three-dimensional targets cool? Because people are three-dimensional. I basically use, most of the time, two different targets. This one and the one I just showed you. And I use this one in a three-dimensional format because people need to learn point of aim, the center mass on a three-dimensional threat. This is kind of what I'm talking about. This is now a three-dimensional target by adding the front part of the target system. And what you get is a very basic three-dimensional approximation of about 140, 150 pound human being. Why does that matter? Well, people are three-dimensional, and as the target's presentation changes to you, your point of aim is going to have to change if you're aiming for center mass. And a lot of people are taught to shoot center mass. The thing is, if the target is oblique or flank, center mass isn't here, it shifts. You have to shoot for the core of the body, the center line of the body, regardless of presentation. And this one is kind of a representation of what I'm talking about there. I shot one group, perfectly ideal presentation, and then a slight rotation, and then almost completely flank, and my shot group has to shift and according to that in order to reach center core of the body, the high thoracic cavity, the heart, the lungs, all those things in there don't react well to gunfire. So when you get into three dimensions, it gets a little bit more complicated. We spend most of our time, most of us came up and most of us still spend most of our time predominantly shooting on two-dimensional targets, which don't really prepare you as well for this. This is what everybody should be using for self-defense focused shooters, but we don't. And the biggest reason for that is tradition. Another reason for that is cost. These targets are not nearly as inexpensive as 30 cents or less a piece of really high quality paper targets. They're a little bit more complicated to assemble. They might not necessarily be able to be easily put up. Your range may not allow you to kind of turn the target stands, or the target stands might not turn. And then there's the issue of cost and freight. Looking at about $2 here. You got to buy a minimum of 50. Freight's going to be a little expensive, and it literally has to come freight. It doesn't just go regular ground UPS or FedEx. So it is a little bit more cost prohibitive, and it's just not as easy. People prefer easy. Doesn't mean they're necessarily getting the best practice and training because they're taking an easier route for target selection, or they never really considered it to begin with. This, of course, does not mean that two-dimensional targets cannot make you a good shooter. They absolutely can. However, if we look at the statistics of accuracy and uses of force, training has improved remarkably over the past 50 years, over the past 20 years, even in the past 10 years. But the accuracy in self-defense shootings hasn't really improved very much. And I think part of that is due to target scoring zones are arbitrary in context. Your target may be preparing your skill set for less accuracy than you think. Without an objectively agreed upon standard, how do we determine if you are an accurate shooter? What standard are you measuring your skill by? Are you just shooting drills? Drills are very closed procedures. They don't necessarily replicate real life, or they may not necessarily provide you with modular skills that are usable in other situations. That doesn't mean drills are bad. Drills are absolutely necessary to part of developing skill as a shooter. The target itself, does it provide you with a realistic scoring zone, or does it provide you with a scoring zone that allows you to shoot a little lazier than maybe you should? This is important. The reason I wanted to do this video first in talking about this topic was, if your scoring zone is very generous, I don't mean kind of generous, I mean very generous, it may give you a false sense of confidence when it comes to skill development, and then when placed on a target that is not of your choosing and someone else is easily meeting the same time, the same distance, accuracy standards on their target, and you try to do it and you can't, it just means that your target kind of set you up for failure. Some target scoring zones provide you the ability to be a more inefficient shooter, but if you only use, or only most of the time use, that type of target, you may not notice that you're developing less inefficient accuracy, less inefficient fundamentals. Also, when it comes to kind of the whole point of this series, target diagnostics, it's much easier to diagnose performance on a target that has a more realistic or a more challenging scoring zone than one is very lazy and almost a participation trophy type of scoring zone. To kind of show you guys what I'm talking about, what I did is I purchased a bunch of the most popular scoring zone targets that I've seen, or that I commonly encounter, or I've used in my career. As a baseline, I shot off the UTC anatomy target. That's going to be my point of precision, my desired point of impact, my 4x6 box. Then I got a transitional target 2, which is a very popular target. You see that a lot of federal agencies use that target. It's been around for a long time. There's also a couple different variations of it. The EIC DoD target, very popular in military circles. A USPSA metric, most of you are probably familiar with that target in its cardboard form, but I ordered it in the paper form to kind of make my life a little easier. The B-21E, the pensive man standing there nervously, aggravatingly with his hand on his hip waiting for you to shoot good or poorly. TQ-19, another target that's been around for a very long time. The NLETCQ, a target that has frustrated me throughout my career because it used to be a target I had to qualify on. The OPOTA, the RQT2, which is another target that some of you are definitely going to be familiar with. And then, of course, the venerable and very popular VTAC anatomy target. Now, what I did with all these targets is I stacked them on top of each other, with my target being the baseline. That's going to be my desired point of impact, my 4x6 point of accuracy. Now, in order to make this as fair as possible, I referenced every target center line off of the very top of the head represented on the target, not necessarily the top of the paper, because they do sit at different elevations. So I'm using the anatomy of the target as my point of reference, starting with the top of the head, going down from there. And I shot the 5s drill. Because I knew this video was already going to be long, I didn't film me actually shooting the drill, but if you're curious about it, I did a whole video on the 5s drill, both for the rifle and for the handgun. The drill is basically this. You shoot 5 rounds from 5 distances from the holster with a starting par time. So 5 rounds at 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 for a total of 25 rounds fired. There's a couple different ways you can start and run the par procedure, so you have time, distance, and accuracy. For this iteration, what I did is I started, what I usually do, I started with a 2-second par time running from a level 2 retention Safari holster, shooting a SIG P320 with a Romeo 2 on it. And I started with that 2-second par. Every time I moved back, I added a second. My standard on my scoring zone, that 4x6 box, I generally consider to, if you've got 20 out of 25 rounds inside that 4x6A zone, you're doing really good, everything is going well. Now just give you a look at how things went. I shot almost a 20 out of 25, depending on if you guys want to give me those line breaks or not. Not my best run, but certainly not my worst. It's a very good high concentration of rounds fired from 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 5 rounds per distance under a par time. So I had my 3 common metrics that we use to measure skill and performance. And then just peeling the targets back, giving you guys a look at how that accuracy would have played out. Now, of course, there is one caveat to this, and that would be if I was using one of these other targets and that was my point of aim, would I have shot as well? Would I have shot where I did? Because you'll notice, based on scoring zones, some of them, the group is completely above what would be considered to be the X-ring, or the ultimate point of precision on the target. I've always had a problem with targets that center their scoring zones. The DoD target is notorious for that, but so is, you know, the NRA, was it the B-27, probably one of the most famous or infamous targets out there. The scoring zone is way too small, or way too low from an anatomical standpoint. So that target doesn't necessarily best prepare us for, well, self-defense shooting. Everything, of course, is subjective, especially in a circumstance or an occasion like this, but kind of the point I'm getting at is if I choose a target like the B-21E and I have that large scoring zone, or if I take the Transtar 4, which I have a very large scoring zone, and that's the target I use to measure my accuracy, does that allow me to be a lazier shooter with lazier fundamentals and still get good results based on the arbitrary nature of my point of precision scoring zone? Or am I just looking for, well, bullet holes? Am I just trying to group them all together no matter what? There's a lot of shooters out there that do that. There's nothing wrong with that. Then there's some other shooters that live in this other camp under a bridge, and they believe in combat accuracy, which doesn't mean anything. It's just a term somebody came up with to justify their poor shooting ability. Combat accuracy is the basic idea that I need to put a lot of rounds all over the body. And I'm like, well, that's good that you think that way, because based on the way your fundamentals work, that's all you're going to be able to do anyway. Fundamentals need to be developed to the highest point of precision possible, but then you get into what is the definition of a good shooter. Kind of already talked about that. There's so many different explanations, or so many different standards out there. How do you as the individual shooter choose one? You have to develop your skill with a target dependency, and all shooters are target dependent when it comes to skill development. Choosing a target that has a reasonable scoring zone is going to better prepare you and better measure your performance when we actually get into diagnosing the bullet holes on the target to help improve our fundamentals. Because it's only fair, I did it one more time. This time I chose the target out of all the targets I used with the largest scoring zone, and I used that as my baseline. And then basically same thing, stacked them all, referencing off the head as my point of the X and the Y, kind of the windage and the elevation, making sure the targets are as equal as possible and stacking them on top of each other. And I ran through the 5 drill again, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 yards, 5 rounds per distance, with that starting par time of 2 seconds. One absolute truism, and I hate speaking in absolutes, in shooting is the larger my scoring zone is, the faster I get to shoot. And if I start with a larger scoring zone, even if I'm thinking to myself, I usually shoot more precise points of aim than this, my target zone or my scoring zone or my desired point of impact is usually smaller than this, this target's got so much more room for activities that I'm able to shoot the drill faster. So I pulled some of my best consistent times on this second run through, and I also shot kind of terribly by my standard. But again, standards are contextual. They also can be arbitrary. Where am I going with all this? Well, I kind of already prefaced it, a little foreshadowing. Choosing your target. Which target is going to be the best, consistent, most usable target that you can use? One of the targets that we see it's going through a renaissance right now is the NRA B-28 bullseye target. A lot of people are shooting those. There's entire Facebook groups dedicated to shooting B8s. The NRA, or Facebook has, I think it's called the B8 group. And there's other groups out there. People post things on Instagram. You see some of the other instructors that live by them, Chuck Pressburg, Kyle DeFore. They love using B8s. Bill Blowers is another guy who's a big B8 guy. I use B8s as well, but probably not to the same degree that they do. They're instructors that get it. That target measures in an isolation the metrics of the fundamentals at various distances under various conditions. When you choose your target, you do want it to be somewhat realistic to kind of prepare you for that self-defense shooting, but it also has to hold you to a standard of consistent performance and consistent accuracy so you can diagnose what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. If you don't have an objective observer watching you shoot, the best you can hope for is remembrance of technique, how things felt, and then you look at the bullet holes in the target and you kind of, you roll some chicken bones and you burn some sage and you read some tea leaves and you try to figure out what's going wrong. The tighter the point of aim, the more consistent that's going to be. And the final thing our targets do for us is they provide us a good visual anchor point for our draw stroke. If I have a more precise A zone, we'll use A zone as our term here, the tightest point of precision on the target being in the head or in the high thoracic. The smaller that is, the more consistently precise my presentation is going to be. This is something I talk about a lot in red dot classes. If I have a visual anchor point that is smaller than my desired point of impact or my margin of error. So say I take that 4x6 box and I draw like a 2.5 inch black circle in it with a marker, and that's where I'm trying to hit, but I'll allow the margin of error to be the 4x6 box, my draw stroke will become more consistently precise, allowing me to get my first hit sooner and also helping me track diagnostics for my fundamentals to provide a more consistent ability to shoot. I understand this video has been long and you haven't actually seen any shooting or any product placement or nothing like that. I just literally wanted to preface this series on target diagnostics by first talking about the targets themselves. My advice, you do not have to use the target that I use, and you should have a couple of different targets based on what you're trying to do. I like the UTC anatomy target because I feel that 4x6 A zone closely approximates a really good critical hit to the high thoracic cavity. I also like the cranial circle because it doesn't give you the total head, and there's a higher point of precision in there for, like, you know, say a pons medulla oblongata midbrain. People refer to it the brainstem. It's medically referred to as a brainstem, type of a brainstem type head, even though on that target it's not technically anatomically correct, but again, it's two-dimensional, so it's not technically anatomically correct anyway. So definitely choose your targets wisely and have an idea of a reasonable metric of standard. Eventually you need to get to a time, a distance, and an accuracy standard for all distances you're going to work on this target. But just talking about target diagnostics, and we'll get into that with the next video, I wanted to preface it, get us ready for it by talking about how targets can be, unless there's context, very arbitrary. So accuracy that's good on one target is terrible or not as good on another. And that's something that we definitely want to be aware of. The larger the scoring zone, the more that's going to affect your actual fundamentals and how well you develop the efficiency and proficiency of your skill set. I'm Eric Count with Sage Dynamics. Choose your targets accordingly.